summarising the findings in that report about investment and low investment in the UK and what that means for our policy and politics. I'll talk a little bit about then our work on industrial strategy, green industrial strategy, and around the role of the state in shaping and steering the British economy. Then Carsten will talk a bit about our work on, or rather his work on public investment and multipliers across the economy. Let me just share my slides and I'll start a timer to try and keep us to time. All right, so low investment in the UK economy, what is it and what does it mean? Okay, so just to run you through some of our kind of findings on the state of investment in the UK economy. The UK has had the lowest level of total investment in the G7 for 24 of the last 30 years. So this is looking at gross fixed capital formation across the economy. And you can see that we are really low compared to our G7 peers, but also that's the same if you compare us to the kind of OECD 38 as well. This is not just a problem of one political party or as a post-austerity problem. It's something which is far more endemic on the British economy. And our view is that low investment leads to economic stagnation, but it also ultimately results in kind of zero-sum politics. We're unable to talk about trade-offs between, we're unable to talk about what we want to achieve as a country because we're stuck talking about trade-offs between what we spend our money on today. Digging into those stats in a bit more detail, looking at business investment, the UK has consistently been among the lowest business investors in the G7 since the early 2000s. In the late 90s, we were above average, but pretty much dipped below soon after. The thicker blue line there is the G7 median, and the other blue lines are other countries. You can see at the top, Japan, and at the bottom, the UK. So we've really firms have really underinvested. And then equally, our public investment, so investment by general government, has also never been above average, both for the OECD compared to the OECD or the G7. So the UK there is the kind of pinky line, and it's fair to say that actually post kind of 2000, the UK did see a quite long-term sustained increase in our public investment. So I'm going to dig into a little bit more detail the story there. So this is pulling out a figure from the paper and looking just at that public investment in the UK. So you can see the story, and this takes us right back to the Second World War. So the dots are changes of Prime Minister. So that one on the left-hand side is Winston Churchill becoming Prime Minister. And we had generally pretty high investment post-war, then really sustained high levels of public investment during the 1960s and into the early 70s. During the premierships of kind of Wilson and Heath. And then at the oil crisis in 74, public investment really fell off a cliff and it really has never recovered. So I don't think it's a bit of a kind of silly statement, but there is some truth to it that really lots of our public infrastructure, motorways, railways, schools, hospitals, we really are still relying on stuff that was built in the kind of second half of the 20th century. So you can see that that kind of sustained increase, if I just go back since 1995, that's when the OECD data starts. But you can see by looking back historically that actually that's quite a generous picture, because really when Labour took over in 1997, we were at the nadir of public investment. And the story of public investment since then has been one that has gradually risen. And then fallen after the coalition government took over, but actually sustained increase since the 2010s as well. What do different political parties plan to do? So we published our paper before the general election, and we made comparisons of the Conservative spending plans, which were shown. This was as of June this year. Conservative plans had public investment falling after the general election. Labour made a commitment in their manifesto to invest an additional £24 billion of public investment over the term. So if you spread that evenly, you would still have public investment falling over this parliamentary term. And one of the arguments that we were making in the paper is that a significant amount of effort should be put on avoiding that happening, both in terms of what good looks like for the British economy, but also in terms of if a government wants to be re-elected, they would struggle to do that with their commitments ahead of the election against a falling backdrop of public investment. And I think that some of those arguments were heeded because in the budget, what we saw was a change of the fiscal rules, which means that the government is going to be able to borrow more to invest more. And that is that yellow line, which sees investment rising over the first few years and falling at the end of the term on current projections, but basically holding public investment pretty constant across this term. And you can see historically that's at a pretty high level. So based on our analysis, Starmer will be the highest investing prime minister since Harold Wilson in 1974. Really more than any of his predecessors in recent history. But that's not because they actually plan to increase public investment over the term. So, in fact, public investment will largely end up where it was at the beginning of the term, at the end of the term, and that's because really what Labour are profiting from are sustained increases actually under Theresa May, Boris Johnson, and then under Rishi Sunak. So the story of investment in the UK has been quite a mixed one, but even with these recent rises, Labour's commitments, we are still very low compared to international exemplars. We made a series of recommendations in the paper, priorities for private investment, what government can do to raise levels of private sector investment and public sector investment. I'm going to basically talk you through some of our work on around industrial strategy, so point one there on the private investment side, and a little bit of around kind of a mission-oriented approach to growth. And then Carsten will speak through, I think, on the public investment side, basically kind of how we decide how public investment is decided and what a public investment quality guarantee would look like. And we're doing okay on time, we're only 7 minutes in. Okay, so industrial strategy, what is it and how would you do it well? So Carsten kind of set me the challenge of making my slides that I should try and set out how an industrial strategy or an active state approach would differ from business as usual. So I've got a bit of like a cartoon of what I think each different position or different end of the spectrum might look like. So my view of like the business as usual, or perhaps you could call this maybe Treasury orthodoxy in the least generous way, would be that economic growth has a rate. So government shouldn't be selective about the types of growth, which sector growth happens or where it happens. And as a consequence, growth policy should be horizontal and impact all firms across the economy equally. People are nodding, so that gives me some confidence that I'm saying something which maybe is at least representative of kind of policymaking orthodoxies. They should avoid creating unequal incentives across the economy. And that's because a free market is the best way of allocating capital. And therefore, the best way that the government can influence growth is really to get out of the way of that. Now, in my view, and in the view of the work that I did with Mariana Mazzucato at UCL, economic growth has both a rate and a direction. There is quality to economic growth as well. You can grow in a carbon emitting way or in a green way, and I'll go into this in a little bit. And if you accept that's true, I think it's right that government should also recognize that different types of growth or different directions of growth have really profoundly different impacts on our economy and broadly on our society. And therefore, growth policy shouldn't seek to be horizontal. It should actually seek to distinguish between its effects on different specific firms and what the kind of specific incentives are and how they align to government's broader objectives. And that's because a market free from the role of the state doesn't actually exist. And therefore, the best way that government can influence growth policy is to play an active, strategic steering role, seeking to shape or direct economic growth in a certain direction that aligns with its objectives, strategic objectives. What kind of way? I say here, like, government should recognize that different types of growth have profound impacts on our economy. Fine, you might accept that, but what do I mean when I say that? So one way that we kind of highlight in our industrial strategy work is that the UK's industrial capabilities have seen an exceptional decline since the 1990s. So here we're comparing our export diversification, so specifically in goods manufacturing, not in services, to the rest of the G7. All of the G7 economies have deindustrialized over that period. The UK has too, but here we're looking at the number of things that we have comparative advantage in, the number of specialisms, because that is actually what defines a developed economy, one that has a range, a broad spread of different economic specializations, and our ability to kind of link those in new and innovative ways. Looking at the G7 average, most countries have stayed pretty much constant across that period. So whilst they've deindustrialized, they've maintained the number of things that they have specialisms in. The UK really is exceptional in the G7 in the decline in our specialization. I think this is really inherent to some of the challenges of growth and economic stagnation that the UK sees today. So this is one way in which I think that the type of growth matters to the economy. My diagnosis, and it's a personal one rather than one that we've demonstrated at IPPR, is that this is a consequence of our decision to specialize in financial services, which have wider economic implications for productive firms in the economy. Another way in which the different types of growth have an impact on the economy is that looking at the difference between, for example, manufacturing and services, those things happen in different parts of the economy and they require different skills within the economy. So if you were to choose a manufacturing versus a services-led industrial policy approach, that has profoundly different impacts on people in different places with different levels of education. And lastly, if you think about the economy's need to achieve our net zero objectives, then we can't simply think that all types of economic growth or even all types of production are equal, because in fact we need to worry quite a lot about what things we're producing in the economy, because we know that the production of certain types of goods, at least on a global basis, are really important towards achieving the net zero transition. So here we're looking at different types of different economic goods and our current global manufacturing capacity with current announcements. And the pink line is the level that we need to achieve net zero. And you can see across all different, these 5 key product classifications, we don't have the current manufacturing capacity to achieve our net zero objectives. So we think that industrial strategy can help achieve different missions. And here we're thinking about the government's economic growth mission, its net zero or kind of clean energy mission, as well as a wider objective to achieve, well, I mean, the government states it as a sub-mission of its economic growth mission to achieve different, to reduce regional economic imbalances. But we have to be rigorous about how we can achieve that. So I'll say a little bit about that. And this really kind of is at the heart of a lot of the work that we've done at IPPR on this. If you want a mission-oriented industrial strategy, what you're seeking to do is to shape the country's economic development around a goal. And this is kind of Mariana's work that IIPP is devoted to. If you want to achieve a clean growth mission, that should all of your policies should be aligned towards that. But how do you actually make that a reality in practice? How do, honestly, people like yourselves, policymakers, actually take this big net zero in 30 years goal and make practical policy decisions? Our view is that that has to be really grounded in an understanding of economic potential and economic path dependency. So we have to be realistic about the path dependency that the UK has taken to get to where we are today. What economic or industrial capabilities does the country have, but also what paths are open to us in the future and what direction do they lead in? There might be various paths that lead towards the UK achieving net zero. Which ones can we select and how do we go about selecting them? And what we have sought to do is to really explore the different path dependencies that are open to the UK economy for us to help to achieve these 3 goals. So I'm going to run through some of that analysis now. Firstly, we look at where does the UK actually have comparative advantage today? And our findings are that across 150 different product classifications, the UK actually has comparative advantage today in almost 1/3 of those. These are our green strengths, or how we call them. The UK is already the 8th largest green exporter in the world. So lots of people, when we kind of talk about having a green industrial strategy, will say to me, okay, but how can we possibly compete against the US or China? The answer is we already are in 1/3 of these products. And we go into quite a lot more detail into different classifications of goods. I'm not going to dive into the data in a huge amount of detail here, but you can see across certain grid components, energy efficiency, CCUS, the UK does currently have strong comparative advantage. That's what we're good at today. That's what does our economy actually produce. But that's not all you need to worry about if you're going to do an industrial strategy properly, because you also should be worrying about what can we do in the future. Industrial strategy shouldn't just seek to protect the economy in the shape and state that it's in today and protect jobs that exist today. It should try and take bets on where we think what things we will need in the future. And partly why we focus on green industrial strategies, that is easier than in other sectors. Maybe we'll get to this in the discussion, but given what I said earlier about knowing the goods that we need to achieve net zero, we actually know largely what we need to produce in the future. That's not the case if you look at automotive or aerospace. We don't have that kind of level of product determinism that we have. That's an advantage because we actually, a common counter to industrial strategy is, oh, you can't get like 50 people around a table and work out what we need in the future. Actually, in net zero, we largely can. The question is, okay, which bits of that is the UK best placed to produce? And it's worth saying we are focusing on manufacturing here for various reasons, but some of that will be in green services too. So the question is not just what are our green strengths, but where are our green potentials? And we used what's called a smart specialization methodology. We worked in collaboration with Enrico Venino, who's an academic at the University of Sheffield. He actually developed this model for BEIS when it was BEIS. And there's a paper that he wrote for BEIS at the time, kind of setting that out. Hopefully not growing dusty on a shelf somewhere, but he looks at a co-location methodology and relatedness. I'm happy to go into some more detail on this, but in the discussion, but this basically looks at what could we be good at in the future, recognizing that firms are actually often changing what they're producing. Toyota originally was a loom manufacturer before it became an automotive manufacturer. Rolls-Royce and BMW made planes before they made cars. The question is not what are we good at, but what industrial capabilities do we have today that could pivot into these areas? I think a great example of that is the high value manufacturing catapult in Sheffield. That Boeing has a factory there as a consequence of that catapult center, that investment. They're able to make engine turbine blades there cheaper than they can in Mexico because of the high levels of productivity in the UK. Why do we have higher levels of productivity in the UK there? It's because Sheffield has had a long history of kind of metal forming and advanced manufacturing. There are latent skills in the workforce. There are supply chains and firms in the local clustering as a consequence of that were then able to develop into this high value manufacturing aerospace cluster. What this tries to get at is basically trying to find those latent clusters around the UK based on a mapping of the entire economy and work out where in these green sectors are we best placed to specialize. And our findings are that across the economy, we are best placed now, not that we are currently world leading in wind, but we are best placed to be world leading in wind, green transport and heat pump production. And the advantage of this smart specialization methodology is that we're able to dig down on a spatial level and show where some of these clusters might potentially be. This is roughly kind of on the left, wind power, middle green transport, and on the right hand side, heat pumps. Where would this kind of like job creation potential be? This is obviously only one way of looking at this, but clearly one that's quite useful to a government that is thinking about an industrial strategy focused around future specialization that is looking to be grounded in kind of a rigorous data methodology. In our view, the UK should choose its priorities based on 5 different considerations: the size of the domestic market, the size of the global market, our existing strengths, but also the potential future capabilities, and fifth, a kind of consideration of supply chain resilience. How would you go about doing that? We advocate for a market shaping approach, and I will very quickly run through this and then hand over to Carsten. But if you think about market shaping, what is a market? Thinking about it as kind of like sectors or a specific product market or prices, what actually impacts that? You can think about it on one hand, production. If you're able to produce things cheaper, prices are cheaper. But it also depends on the purchasing side too. So on the demand side, do we currently have sufficient demand for electric vehicles to support manufacturing? Do we have sufficient demand for heat pumps to support manufacturing? So we think that industrial policy should think about both sides of this. And again, on each side, you can think about costs, which would be perhaps around subsidy, but also around rules and regulations equally. So the Bidenomics kind of Inflation Reduction Act plan was very much focused around the cost side, around tax credits. That was the only option politically available to the Democrats. But in the UK, we have greater degree of political alignment on the need to achieve net zero. So there's greater scope for kind of directive economic regulation. Although I would say that some of the controversy around, for example, the zero emission vehicles mandate shows that the challenges of actually dealing with that in practice and trying to shift an economy or a market which maybe has leaders or laggards within it. Again, as an example, we've been working through putting this into practice on different sectors, and we've spoken to, for example, every single heat pump and boiler manufacturer in the UK. Some of those are very eager to start producing more heat pumps, and some have said, we shall never produce heat pumps in the UK. We would rather just pay the fine or go bankrupt than produce a heat pump. I would suggest those people will always be very loud and vocal in the media about how punishing government regulations are. And actually, if you're trying to take this steering or shaping approach, you might have to learn how to grow a bit of a political backbone to face up to some of those opponents who will be negative about you in the media. So in addition to thinking about those kind of production and purchasing sides, you also then need the kind of actual governance structures who is thinking about what the specific sectoral dynamics are in the heat pump market and which tools to use strategically. And in our view, industrial strategy is the kind of agglomeration of specific industrial policies, a whole range of them aligned to a wider strategic objective. And then in addition, you have the kind of wider economic conditions that economic policies seek to achieve. So that might be R&D, skills, trade policy. Some of those can be industrial policies if they are specifically targeted, but equally, it's very important to have kind of some of those as just the foundations for growth. I ran through that really quickly, and suffice to say, in one of our papers, we have an extremely long, non-exhaustive list of all the different kind of policies that would fit into each of those buckets. We're currently working through those three priority sectors and kind of demonstrating how you would seek to pick tools from this toolkit and put them into practice. The ones on wind and heat pumps are out there published now. The green transport one, actually particularly topical at the moment, but will be out early next year. And equally, we're liaising with the kind of industrial strategy unit and speaking to people there, some of whom might be on the call, about kind of what our data and the toolkit means for the government's industrial strategy. That was a lot of information, so I'll pause there and maybe we can get into some of it in the discussion, and I'll hand over to Carsten.
Great, thanks very much. I'll try to keep this brief, so we have at least half an hour for discussion. Just a quick reminder how George's bit and my bit fit together again. So, I'll share, okay.
You got it?
Yeah, one sec. I think you just have to go left.
Right, I won't do that again. Okay, perfect, amazing. So just, it's conceptually all clear how it fits together. Hi, everybody, thanks for having us. So overall investment in the economy basically has these two components: private investment and public investment. And private investment is sort of one way of thinking about it is you need industrial strategy to crowd in private investment to get up that bit of the chart. But there's, of course, an overlap between an industrial strategy and public investment. So some of the things that George talked about will be delivered through public investment, so the government actually making the investments, but also a lot of non-government investment things, such as, procurement strategy and regulation and so on. And now I'm just going to talk about the public investment side of things, and specifically, John showed this chart of like Rachel Reeves has announced, a much bigger investment envelope than was planned by the previous government. And so in the spending review, all eyes will be on, well, what should we spend it on? And if we want in the Q&A, we can get a bit more into like how does the Green Book work and how does the Treasury make decisions on spending. But in a nutshell, it's basically you have some top level direction, right? So the government can say and ministers can say, these are the priority areas, sort of on a macro level. We want to spend more on rail than on roads, for example, or we want to spend more on ports than on refurbishing schools. So that's political strategy, but then there's also the Green Book process, which basically does sifting within those categories. And so what I'm going to talk about is basically, well, now that we have this envelope of investment, how should this both high-level decision-making, but also the Green Book level decision-making, how can it be improved? So let me just go through this real quick. Great. And it's useful for thinking about, well, what are the best projects? Like what to distinguish between the different reasons why you might want to do it. So there might be just something might have very low economic returns, but it might be great for other things like well-being or security that don't necessarily have an economic return. So here I distinguish between those and just like the pure hard GDP returns, because part of the political imperative at the moment, especially with Labour's growth mission, is we want to get growth up. We only want to invest in things that have high growth. So this is basically an analysis of, well, what has the highest growth impact, and sort of abstracts from a lot of other very valid reasons why you might want to do public investment. And I also distinguish between the short term and the long term. I'm going to look at the short term first. So you might all be familiar with the concept of multipliers. It's basically if the government spends £1 of public money, how much private or how much economic activity is triggered by that. So if you have, say, a multiplier of 2, that means, and we're talking about the short term here, so about 2 years. If you put £1 in, you get over 2 years, £2 of GDP out of it, and then it disappears. And you basically see that there's quite a lot of variation in the literature. So it depends partly where the economy is and different methodologies, but basically it could be low, it could be high. And then we know from recent examples, such as US industrial policy, that you can get really high multipliers if you look at sort of sector, a narrow sector focus, where basically it's a multiplier of 2.6 within 1 year of green industrial policy. And so I'm very keen to get feedback on this because it's still work in progress. So basically, some ideas of how to distinguish, say, in the Green Book process, between, well, is it a low multiplier or is it a high multiplier? Are these 5 factors, which are basically drawn from the economics literature. One is policies that have network effects. So for instance, if you support electric vehicle, a charging network, consumers will say, okay, great, now there's this network, I can buy a car. So you incentivize separate activity by consumers in the economy. So you get more bang for your buck. Another one is policies that use certain tools. So certainly the Biden industrial strategy approach using tax credits was very effective in crowding in business investment, because it was basically output linked to output. So it actually led businesses to produce more or invest more in manufacturing. So looking at the tools can make a difference. Thirdly, looking more at shovel-ready projects, so you can get them out of the door more quickly. There's actually big literature on how a lot of public investment takes ages to build. and therefore you have very much delayed effects. Similarly, building on existing programs rather than starting from scratch. And then fifthly, looking at things that create certainty for businesses. Again, crowding in investment by businesses at the same time. So these are some ideas, and very curious, including after this seminar, if you have any comments on this, or if you think things are missing, or if it's not convincing, you work with a green book and you're like, this is not how we would think about this. Very interested. So these are some criteria to distinguish. I'm going to keep the discussion of crowding out perhaps for the Q&A. Now looking at the long term. So this was the short term impact. So that things you might want to do to get a very quick GDP benefit in the short term. Now in the long term, it's less of a demand side question and more how much does it increase supply? How much more productive does it make the economy? And again, there's a lot of literature on this. The term here is less multiplies. It's the capital elasticity of the output elasticity of public capital. So basically, how much return do you get on any pound spent of public investment in terms of more productivity? And so the OBR assumption, looking at the literature as a whole, is quite conservative. So we're saying, look, there's a lot of studies that actually could get much higher returns. And it's partly, again, looking at the literature, sort of core infrastructure that could have higher returns than spending on things like, refurbishing public buildings or sort of capital grants to businesses. But that's just the literature. But the past is often not a good guide to the future. So the question remains, how do we know if something has these high returns, and how do we know if it has lower returns? And again, here I propose 5 ways to look at, 5 categories to look at this. And first of all is actually standard Green Book benefit cost ratio approach. And it is indicative, like that people do look at like how good are these investments. So the Elizabeth line had a wider benefit cost ratio of 3 to 1. It's now actually been found to have a 4 to 1 ratio. So, these are definitely a good starting point. But I argue that there's others that are worth looking at and that are a bit harder to do. And that's why they're not yet in the Green Book. And I think it's quite an exciting time, because there's a government that actually wants to make transformative investments. And the Green Book, in theory, because there was the Green Book reform, it allows for accounting for transformative investments. So I think the bottleneck is less, could you do it within the Green Book? The bottleneck is more, well, how can we credibly make a scenario estimate for how transformative it will be, how high the returns will be? And so I think getting a bit into the nitty-gritty of the economic literature could be quite useful. So one could be addressing what I call bottleneck investment. So if you think of the electricity grid, it's well known that it's holding back renewables investment. People are waiting to connect to the grid and therefore not investing. Similarly, skills shortages are arguably holding back heat pump rollout because we haven't got enough qualified people. So investing in these might unlock much more activity, very much non-linear benefits. Similarly, there's a new economics literature on looking at investments public investments have a different effect depending on where in the economy you invest. So if something is more upstream, so as an input good for a lot of other industries, you get ripple effects, again, non-linear benefits. So taking grids again, if you roll out grids faster, it trickles down through the economy through lower electricity costs more quickly. Fourthly is a lot of the things that George was talking about. So you can see industrial strategy as a way of coordinating the economy. You have multiple players that all need to be aligned, that wouldn't necessarily coordinate through free market mechanisms on their own. And doing that can have non-linear effects. So you get more than the sum of its parts because you reap this coordination. And, there's a literature on, the Apollo missions and I was quite amazed. Like the US spent 0.7% of GDP in the 60s on Apollo-related industries. So that's quite significant R&D policy. And it sort of led to a lot of technological advancement and later GDP growth. Taking into account some of these estimates from the literature, again, could justify picking certain projects over others. And for ultimately, say, the OBR, I might say, actually, at least we have a scenario where a lot of these investments have much higher payoffs than they currently assume. And remember, they're here at the bottom, around the 25th percentile of estimates. So if the case can be made that these effects will be present, then you get higher, you might have get higher returns. I'll leave it at that. Maybe we can get a bit more to the discussion on how this could feed into the Green Book process. But for now, I would say thank you for listening and for having us.
Great. Thank you so much, both. Have we got any questions from the room or from anyone at home? If not, I'll kick us off. And when you ask a question, if you could just say what department you work for, where you work, that'd be great. So I just wanted to Carsten, this question's for you. Just kind of translate what you just went through as sort of someone who works on quantifying economic impacts of different policy options in government. So in my mind, there's sort of two processes. There's one which is the cost benefit analysis, CBA, BCR, Green Book stuff, which I think is the sort of micro line that you had up there. And then there's the macro side of things, which is where the OBR is quantifying macroeconomic impacts of tax, welfare, and spend policies, but spend is sort of one big chunk. So the spending multipliers are not particularly differentiated. So I guess, are we saying that within the sort of BCR spending trade-off quantifications that we do, we could add in some of that sort of macro impact analysis that happens as quite a separate process that the OBR runs, but we could do that like within our departments and kind of enrich, I guess, our business cases and calculation of impacts, and that we're probably missing out quite a lot of those sort of macro impacts. I just wanted to, is that sort of what you were suggesting?
Yes. So actually, if let's just kind of might show another.
You talk and I'll get it.
Slide. Okay, great. So I think both. So I think the idea is we're missing some of these effects. But correct me if I'm wrong. You might all say, no, we really calculate scenarios with transformative benefits. Yes. But the idea is that on a sort of Green Book project level where you pick projects, there could be more of these sort of macro effects. So that's sort of the bottom level is sort of the micro level. Individual projects. And then, so it could inform this, but it could also inform a slightly meso level, which is sort of the more strategic objectives, portfolios, and programs. So sort of ministers might want this information as well, but it might have to come from a sort of bottom-up analysis as well. But then ultimately, and maybe, in fact, the timing of it is it starts on that level and then it trickles up. You'd also want the OBR ultimately, or some kind of external well, it may or may not be in the OBR, might also want to use these differential returns and report it to the public in a sort of simple to assess way. Because I get the assessment is that there is a lot of political economy pressure to show that the investments that are made are have high returns and will increase growth, and sort of allowing the OBR to distinguish between different types of investment will be really useful. But it should basically work with people on the micro level and on the meso level
And the people who have the expertise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I imagine it's sort of I call it sort of a macro informed approach. So you want the sort of the idea is that just looking on a very narrow project by project assessment, you might miss some of the macro benefits of coordination, of addressing network effects, of addressing the bottlenecks. So you want people or individual analysts to step out and take the bigger picture into account. But yes, you want to do it on the micro level. And again, it's kind of an exciting time because there is a demand for this, but it also involves a lot of people thinking outside the box and engaging with the macro literature. And so I guess this group is actually really great for starting this discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. Oh, let's take a couple in the room. First, so Magda, do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you. How specific do you think we can get with that? So, like, love the kind of list of factors, short term, long term.
Yeah.
You know, can see that being really persuasive. Kind of more persuasive though, if you can be like, look, for the network effect in this is comparable to a previous policy like this one, whereby we calculated that the range for the multiplier might have been between X and Y. Do you think we might get ever to, like, obviously not like very specific quantification, but something akin to being able to make those arguments in that way?
I think it will really depend on the area. So some will for some we have lots of case studies like EV rollout. I think there's like just quite a lot of, I don't know how acceptable international case studies are, but I presume, yeah. So I think for EVs, say there are a lot of comparable case studies. You'd still the estimates vary a lot, and so the error bands vary a lot, and I think it's about maybe the answer are scenarios. So like an upper scenario, you get actually all of these benefits, and in the lower scenario, you don't, and then we just keep updating what we experience and like whether our priors were right. In other areas where it's more novel, I think there's maybe not as many case studies on heat pump rollout. And then you build scenarios more on theory and on maybe comparable industry examples. And it will be less rigorous. And again, that's probably the reason why it hasn't been done. But hopefully there can still be progress can be made based on like rigorous reasoning. And scenario analysis is a thing in business. It is a thing in the government functions. And yeah, maybe it's about living a bit with the uncertainty and communicating that.
Just to let everyone know, in case you didn't already, that we are gonna be able to go through to 5:10, so we do have a bit of time for questions. I think we have one more in the room, and I know there's a couple online. So should we just go to this one in the room?
Yeah, I just had one point on what you just said, and then I'll ask a question. One is like when you say rigorous, are we just saying that these sets of things that we know in our current analysis are bad, are okay, and these things that we know are newer are not considered rigorous when we account for these things because they're newer, rather than actually it's less rigorous, it's just a different set of trade-offs? That's one question. And the second is, I'd like you to expand a little bit more on the place-based nature of some of the stuff you've done, because you've sort of mentioned cluster development. You've mentioned that these place-based making is important, but I think much like a lot of our policy making, we say that place-based policy making is important, we do it, but then we say these things, but then actually it's quite hard to think about, well, our national target for net zero for 2030, what does that mean for heat pumps? What does that mean for heat pumps versus heat networks versus hydrogen? What does that mean for leads? And I think it would be a bit more interesting to understand some more of those tools on the place-based side, if there's anything more you can say about that.
I can answer that. So I think when we're thinking about kind of trying to seek to lean into the strategic advantages that already exist in kind of a latent way, that those things exist in the real world now in places, right? And I think given the kind of economic agglomeration effects around kind of being able to combine skills and supply chains in one place, that tends to manifest as cluster-based kind of policy. What we have identified is that kind of that has to be place-based in that these things are, we're not, if we think about the UK being a heat pump superpower, if that's what you want to be, like your policy objective to be, it's not going to be kind of like a flat distribution of manufacturing jobs across the country. It's likely to be really concentrated in one or two places, probably where those kind of, well, largely boiler manufacturers are. So it's really hard to have the conversations on an abstract level. So it's quite different for each sector. So for specifically on heat pumps, the reason that we come out as really strong on heat pumps in our analysis is that they're quite technologically similar to boilers, and we make a shit ton of boilers in the UK. We're the world's largest manufacturer of boilers. No, was Europe's largest, and what were the world's largest until 2009. So we just make a lot of those, and we know how to do it. And it's a technologically similar product. So what you're seeking to achieve is to get those boiler manufacturers to pivot from making one thing to another. So that will be hyper localized because those boiler jobs are very localized. How do you make that decision though and make it practical? I think there's a real interesting challenge there. We've got a bit of work coming up with IPPR North, which will be published in February, on how do you make like national mapping link up with regional policy making. I think it's really essential to have some degree of kind of like strategic authority in the centre, to otherwise you end up, I mean, I was kind of, when I worked for Mariana, that was when Greg Clark had the industrial strategy in 2017. And there were 36 local industrial strategies. And I think like the joke at the time was that all of them claimed to have a robotics cluster in their kind of combined authority or in their lab. You need some authority to be able to say that's not realistic. We're going to focus in some areas, but it's also true, like in the centre, if you're doing this kind of analysis, like we're just looking at quite highly aggregated ONS data and trade data to get to this, whereas some combined authorities or local authorities or devolved authorities might actually have a better understanding of what is going on in the ground. The example that I made of the high value manufacturing catapult wasn't a central government spending decision, although Peter Mandelson will claim that it was. But it was a decision by Yorkshire Forward, the regional development agency at the time. So I think that local and regional devolved policy makers have a massive role to play in kind of connecting this kind of national strategy and discrimination between sectors with what does actually on the ground policy making look like. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it'd be useful if there's some relation to that to the tool, tools or things that we can do in our analysis, ex post or ex ante, to account for those effects a bit more.
Yeah, I think, again, it's quite hard without being specific about the sectors again, so quite different. So the alternative would be like, in our wind industrial strategy, we talk about the need for an expansion in port capacity, and that can only ever be delivered through basically subsidy at a local level or regional level. So maybe we can take the conversation offline. It'd be useful to discuss.
On the rigor point, what is rigorous? Super quick. I think I'd be very curious what each of you think on what is the line where people say this is considered a rigorous case study to build on or not. But just looking at the literature, I would say some of it is newer, so it's perhaps less accepted. So especially the industrial policy literature is just like receiving, in economics, it's receiving a renewed attention after decades of people not really researching here. So there's newer stuff coming out now, and I think there'll be more rigorous things to build on, and certainly like cool studies on like Chinese export subsidies and like the impacts and R&D subsidies. So I think there is more stuff coming. It's a bit novel. I think in climate policy, it's a bit more, there's more, and also more investigation of like certain mechanisms, like learning by doing, sectoral spillover effects. that I think it's just a more accepted evidence based, I would say. But yeah, again, less on the sort of more economy-wide strategic stuff. We don't have many studies on like Apollo mission type work. Yeah, so but some, I'd say some, and I think it's worth trying to build on it.
Some questions online. I think Harry, your hand is number one. You might be on mute.
Yeah.
No, I think you're off now.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, perfect. Okay.
Can't hear you. Oh, I think this is the room. Hang on. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
We just need to sort the audio settings. Just give us. Okay, that should.
It could be me.
We can hear you online, if that helps.
Oh, you can hear me online.
So
Okay.
it's not you. We definitely can.
I can hear you in the room now. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. I'll go into my question. It's not quite fully formed in my head, so forgive me if it's not completely articulated. But I think this is for you, George, on the industrial strategy side. And I wonder if we could like zoom into industrial strategy through the lens of mandates, because I think often a mandate is seen as maybe an easy way to get the policy outcome you want, but not necessarily thinking of like the whole condition of the industrial strategy that goes alongside it. So say, for example, if we were looking at a mandate in boiler phase out and you don't have like good supporting industrial strategy or even good understanding of the cost dynamics, that might actually be quite expensive for consumers, or maybe have some poor distributional outcomes, or sometimes it's seen as an easy way to like get those reinforcing feedback loops you want and some of those like ripple effects you're talking about. But if it's just done in isolation without other supporting policy, are mandates that effective? And like what are some of the adverse consequences of just looking at mandates as an approach can that be? Because it's sort of industrial policy, but it's fixing the supply side where it's like sticks without any carrots, isn't it? And I guess I'm just understanding of that market shaping element of mandates and how you view them.
Yeah, so I'm really supportive of mandates as a policy for that reason, in that I think that, especially the kind of industrial policy that I was talking about, which is basically kind of like trying to identify specific areas of potential and really squeezing them or giving them the boost they need, and trying to get down that learning curve as quickly as you can, then a policy that seeks to essentially incentivize leaders and punish laggards in the sector is basically what you're going to have to achieve. And I think a mandate where you can give predictability over a long time period about increasing degrees of kind of production or levels of production, certainty around the kind of demand side, ideally around the demand side and the supply side, is what you want to achieve. I think there's a real problem that if you don't align those demand and supply side levers, or you fail to think about like what needs to happen behind that demand, that supply, that you end up with misaligned incentives, and you can basically just destroy a whole sector that way if you don't do it really well. I mean, I think there's examples of that in history. I think that the contracts for difference was a really transformative policy in incentivizing kind of the build out of wind, but it was not connected with any kind of production mandate. And that meant that at the same time that we were becoming a world leader in installation of offshore wind, we were allowing factories to shutter in the UK and move overseas, and that was a massive failure. So like there's a risk that you get that wrong. I think looking at some of the challenges that we face today, like I would be really supportive of using phase mandates in things like heat pump manufacturing. But the biggest barrier in our findings to heat pump supply is a lack of heat pump demand. So you have to absolutely link that with cost considerations or regulation on the demand side. Otherwise, you're going to be, like you said, essentially creating a stick for producers without a carrot to go with it.
Okay, I think we've got one more question online from Ed.
Hiya. Hope you can hear me. Firstly, I think Antonia in the
chat has asked a question about if you've got any reflections on the role of the National Wealth Fund around these investment challenges, which I would be interested to hear because I'm actually from the National Wealth Fund. But that wasn't my question. Please do answer that as well if you get the chance. Just to go back to your cartoon sort of this difference between the sort of I don't know, the neutral state and the strategic state. My sort of cartoon response to it is that I think it's worse than that. I think our sort of, call it treasury brain or call it the sort of, economics 101 assumptions is the sort of horizontal neutral state approach. But our political economy revealed way of working and politicians revealed preferences inevitably given the sort of challenges they face and the sort of the noise they're dealing with is to back the loudest stakeholders who aren't the people we want to be strategic about, but are the people who are feeling the most pain, who are the future losers from being strategic. So I just wonder if you've considered that and how we overcome that. I mean, it's a totally natural thing, but it's something we're going to have to overcome.
Yeah, it's a really big question and probably one that we don't have the time to get into. In detail, but I think it's depressing to hear you say that it's even worse than I said, because that was kind of like my most cartoonish bad version of the status quo. But I think there's what's the name of the guy? Brad DeLong has written quite a bit about kind of how a lack of industrial policy is by definition a pro-financialization policy, and I definitely can see strains of that in the British economy as well. I think a lack of, and again, this is my own view rather than IPPR's house view, a lack of wanting to specify what we want to be good at is why our specialization has fallen so dramatically over. We haven't really tried to be good at specific things, whereas other countries really have, beyond kind of financial services. And I think that has led to a kind of atrophy of state capacity in parts of government to really try to understand specific sectoral dynamics and what the role of the state is in remedying those. And I think that those dynamics are particularly challenging in manufacturing, and that is why that is worthy of specific consideration through industrial policy and government policy, because that is where kind of big questions of state policy like subsidy, trade regimes, patient capital can all line up to really stymie specific investments into places. So I think that's really where the role of the state is particularly important. I'm sure there are other like services sectors that I can't think of off the top of my head where that's true, but it particularly manifests in production, large scale production, where you're talking about kind of 10, 20-year payback cycles for firms who are making those investments. And I think that essentially, like, how do you then pull back from that? I think it has to be along with a kind of a program of state capacity expansion within government to really try to understand sectors. Essentially, it's kind of a problem of neoliberalism in that a lot of the bits of government, this is again a cartoon version, tell me if I'm wrong or if it's worse than I think, but a lot of the bits of government that actually seek to understand, okay, what are the dynamics in the heat pump manufacturing space, are not in government departments. They're often basically in regulators. That's, if you look at the CMA market studies, they're really great investigations into like the system-wide dynamics within a sector. That's the kind of level of thinking that we need if we're actually going to deliver really high quality industrial policy, I think. I know Simon Sharp has spoken to you, this group before, like he talks a lot about systems mapping and tipping points, and you can only really understand that if you have a good understanding of the sectors and the dynamics within it. So I think that has got to be a massive part of this. In my view, that should sit within a kind of department with sufficient Whitehall clout that it can go toe to toe with the Treasury. And I don't think there's a way of, I think it's very hard to deliver that through the current machinery of government set up. partly like to come very quickly onto the role of the National Wealth Fund. But I think currently that the National Wealth Fund is likely to be the main kind of channel through which some of this funding is delivered. Like we had a really good conversation last week with Louis and some colleagues at the National Wealth Fund and about kind of delivery. There's a report I can point people to that we wrote on the role of the National Wealth Fund in kind of boosting investment and in delivering an industrial strategy. I think that it's really currently set up to do good investment on the production side. I'm quite interested in whether it can also work on the purchasing side. So are there ways that the government could maximise the space created by the changing of the fiscal rules to public sector net financial liabilities to create financial vehicles within a National Wealth Fund, which could be used to boost demand of heat pump or electric vehicles, or I don't know, housing in the economy as well. But that's currently beyond the mandate of the National Wealth Fund, which seems to be better placed to do more of the cost reduction / subsidy on the production side. But I don't think all of that industrial strategy stuff can ever be delivered by the National Wealth Fund. It needs kind of like a department to be able to do that thinking and wider policy delivery. For example, regulation is unlikely to ever be in the remit of the NWF.
Great. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for. So thank you so much for coming along in person to give us this talk. It was really excellent. Favourite fact was that Toyota used to be a loom company. Did not know that.
They claim